constantly prioritizing to be able to deliver the greatest value and make sure that that value is provided in a timely manner. Most often, it's done in a time box method. So we have a time frame in which we deliver the highest value that we can. Those are small steps where we're trying to get that information, that result, as quick as possible back into the hands of the customer or whomever we are doing the work for. We still plan the work. We plan extensively, but the time frame for that planning is much, much smaller than it has been in the past. One of the other concepts is that we are constantly incorporating and asking for feedback on what we're doing. So rather than having the discussion of what we're supposed to do and then going off and creating that result and then coming back and saying, is this what you really wanted? We're constantly reviewing that. We're constantly having that communication and collaboration on what we're doing. And as a result, we're able to make those course corrections whenever they're needed. One of the things that Agile has recommended is that the teams, because of trying to move as quickly as we can, be cross-functional and be co-located so that there's not the time delay between trying to find somebody to answer a question, and often that communication is an overheard communication rather than an email asking for something, so that that whole process can be sped up. The other part about the team is going to determine what they are able to deliver. They will become accountable for making sure that happens, but they're also empowered to be able to determine how best to make sure that delivery happens. So the biggest change from a project management standpoint comes with this inversion of what we used to call the iron triangle or the triple constraint. In a traditional project, we look at the scope and what we're required to deliver, and based on that we determine how long it's going to take, and based on the resources and all, how much it's going to cost. Now, in Agile, we turn that upside down because we have a time box length that we are working within, and as a result, we take within that time frame or that schedule, we determine what we can deliver that has the most value. So rather than having the scope drive, in this case, it's basically the time that is driving. Now, the cost as a result is mainly just the idea of how many people do you have working for what period of time, and therefore you have the cost for that time period. So when we move into the idea of planning, and we use the word adaptive planning, because we're still creating a plan, but it's an evolving plan. It covers everything from the initiating of the project until the closure, which may include a lot of different milestones and interim steps in between. But it's always based on what are the goals of the project, based on the organization, what are the values, what risks still are there, obviously constraints, especially in the area of compliance, the feedback from the stakeholders, and the findings that we have when we do our reviews, either with a customer or with the team itself.
When I manage projects, I like to see how does the project align with the strategic goals of the organization. What is the mission? What is the vision? What are the strategies, the objectives of the organization? And what purpose, what value is this project going to produce for the business? Quite often we look at the portfolio management in the organization, how we are aligning those and making sure we're providing benefits back to the business. We looked at the product charter and look at modifying that charter to make sure we're currently in line with. We're looking at the initial product backlog and the risk identification that goes along with it when we start off the project, and looking at various release times. We're looking at how much, what can I deliver to the business people in a very short period of time rather than developing it all at once and then using the Big Bang theory of producing it at the end of the project. So we're giving a little bits and pieces as we go along in this project. Chartering is very similar to the project charter. We're looking at basically definition at a high level. We want to gain agreement with the executives or the people who are providing us the requirements for this project. We want to make sure that the stakeholders are all aligned, especially if you're working with multiple stakeholders from cross-functional organizations. We want to build that consensus, shared vision. And quite often you'll find one or two of the executives that really have a passion or a vision for what they want to accomplish. And the other stakeholders are going along with it because, well, they support it, they believe it, they look at why we're doing the project, that vision, what we're trying to accomplish, and what is the success criteria. Quite often today, the benefits of the project are really based on intangible benefits rather than tangible ones. All the tangible ones we pretty much have been doing the last 20 or 30 years. It's those intangible ones that are really hard to identify to cost justify it. But usually somebody has a vision as to why we need to accomplish it.
So when we talk about Agile, we have a number of different planning cycles. And I really believe in some ways we do more planning on an Agile project than on a predictive project. So we start with this whole visioning aspect where the project is selected, the initiating has been done to get this actual effort started. That whole vision, the charter as we go through. And then we go into a roadmap because once again, we are not going to deliver everything at one time. So we start breaking this up into milestones that are most often known as releases or themes. And we start to come up with a product backlog. So we have this roadmap that we're able to talk about where we have the various aspects that are going to be delivered. So this goes back into a traditional project just as well. If we can start to identify when we are going to be delivering certain pieces, maybe this is our rolling wave concept where we look at an identification of this is what we're going to work on right now, this is what's going to be worked on in the future. Realizing in an adaptive and agile world, those things that are far out there in the future may change for any sort of reason. We will also have the product backlog because that's where we start to identify those different features and functions we need for the product. So then we go into each one of those chunks that we said on that roadmap, which are considered releases. These are the things that are going to be completed so that we can take that full package back to a customer or to market if we're actually creating a product that's going to be sold. And we identify in that planning what it is we're going to have, very large features, maybe what we call epics, different terminology based on the size and the complexity of those various features. And we come up with a backlog. Now, this backlog idea is becoming more and more common in project management terminology, in the fact that this is the stuff that people want. Being able to identify those features and functions, but not at this point yet trying to figure out when we're going to put each one in, what the value of it is, what the priority, but being able to have the ability to just say, these are my wish lists, very similar to if you go onto Amazon and you put things in your wish list, and later on you'll determine what you're actually going to purchase. So we move from that into smaller chunks where we are going to be able to identify in a small period of time what we're actually going to be able to produce. What are those ideas that have been prioritized and we've determined what we can do. We use the term user stories. User stories are a way that a person can actually say, I as a particular type of role in the organization or customer want to be able to do the following in order to be able to have some sort of benefit. Those are what the customer or user is going to say, this is what I want the result to be, but we know it has to be broken down into the various steps. So this is, once again, very much like progressive elaboration when we identify tasks.
That roadmap, I like to facilitate a session with the product owner, the executives, the business analysts, whoever needs to be involved to give us guidance as to what needs to be released in these time frames. So I facilitate that session. Usually it only takes about 2-3 hours to do one of those things, and perhaps you need to come back a few days later and review it, but it's really not that difficult to do. Most of the executives are used to working in that environment at a very high level, and that's what the roadmap is doing. It's also giving your releases and when you want to produce things that are of value to the business people.
So we talked about the idea we have iterations. These are the smallest chunks of work that we're going to do. There's a number of different ideas within this. First of all is this idea of iteration 0. Some of the Agile methods talk about it, some of the ones don't. If we are in an technology supported type of project, very often this is very critical to take the time to get things set up so that you're ready to hit the ground running. Your releases, as we said, are things where we're actually able to take a combined idea and put it out. So, we see this with our apps on our phone. A lot of times, like, for instance, in my Starbucks, they don't tell me they released a new app, but all of a sudden I'll see that it looks different because they've put out a new release. Now, within that release, there are some development things that have to take place, and most often these are in much smaller periods of time where individual small pieces of work are completed. Now, a lot of times we end up having this iteration H, which is the iteration right before we finalize the release. And during that time, there's some hardening that is done, as we say, to be able to clean up, whether it's clean up documentation, whether it's to be able to clean up some sloppy coding, some things that didn't look exactly the way they are, that final review and ready to put it out. It also has to do with the transition. And as project managers, we all know that even though we complete the project, there's things that have to go on after that. So whether we train people, whether we have documentation, all of that, that is normally completed during that iteration H.
Yeah, well, in iteration 0, on one of my projects, we needed to develop some data warehousing applications, but the company didn't have any software. So it took us about 3 months to go out and evaluate 3 different software vendors, select the vendor, install the software, and get ready to going. It took about 3 months to do that. So iteration 0, you're dealing with basically setting up that technical environment. If the technical environment is already there, you really don't need to do an iteration 0. But it just depends upon what you're trying to accomplish. More mobile applications that we're using, that technology has to be in place in your organization in order to develop that. And a lot of companies still haven't implemented that mobile technology, but we're seeing that basically being developed today.
So once again, this iteration 0, hopefully you would only have to do it for that first release. After that, you would have things going, unless all of a sudden you decide that I want to be able to take this and move it to another platform. A lot of times also this, not as just the development environment, the testing environment, the security that's needed for those people, especially if you have remote project team members. Once again, as Steve said, this may take some time. I had a project where we spent almost 3 months in iteration 0 getting everything ready to go before we would start to deliver any sort of customer results. So some of the things also that are part of that high level, part of that iteration 0, especially if you have a technology supported project, and I'm specifically using that term rather than an IT project, because to me a business project that is going to deliver results most often today has some technology aspect that is supporting it. And so what we have to identify ahead of time, What kind of browsers might we be using? What kind of server, database? Are there some security issues that need to be identified? Once again, making these decisions before we start to actually develop that result. It also starts to expose some of the potential risk we may run into, and especially when we're out on the bleeding edge. A lot of times these Agile projects support marketing, those type of areas that are not real sure where they want to be, but they've seen some things, and can we try this here in this organization? Well, you know, we don't have the resources. We may need to find them. We may need to see how long it's going to take. There's a lot of things here that we have to look at, and most often we do this during this iteration 0. So when we start to actually look at the features itself, what we want to be able to do is look at some prioritization and figure out what the different value of the features we have to be able to, okay, it's not going to go back there. We want to look at the features that have been requested as part of that backlog, and we want to look at the value of each one as well as what is the cost. Now, oftentimes you don't hear in the Agile world talk about anything other than we're just going to prioritize these features as to their business value. But a lot of times what we have to look at is what is the cost of doing one, and also what is the dependency of those, because sometimes even though a feature is very valuable to the organization, we really need to do a couple of other ones first before we do that one. So those are some things that we want to look at. The other thing on the prioritization is we still have to look at risk. And we need to be able to understand within our organization, are there some features we can put in order to be able to mitigate that risk, or even actually be able to remove that risk. So there's a couple of prioritization schemes that Agile talks about. Moscow is one that you may not know and recognize the name, but if you've ever done any sort of weighting on a RFP, or when you've reviewed a proposal that comes back in, you've used this concept already. What are those identified pieces on that RFP that you absolutely must have? What are the ones you should have? What are the ones you could have? So we prioritize what we want to have accomplished through this idea of Moscow scheme. The Kano model is a little different, and a lot of times project managers are not aware of this one. It's more of a marketing aspect where product managers and product people look at, if I put this feature in, is it really going to excite my customers, or is it going to be something that they really don't care less about? So that's another way that we use when we start prioritizing some of the actual features and backlog items for our project. So as I said, when we do the estimating, we still estimate the scope and somewhat the schedule as we start to identify what we can get finished. There's some terms that we use. We're sizing the scope by sizing these individual user stories that are part of our backlog. There's a number of different ways of doing this. We talk about t-shirt sizes. We talk about using Starbucks cup size as a way to be able to determine if it's small, medium, or large. It's more fun. It's not this rigid as we go through. Now, planning poker is one of those estimating techniques that uses a Fibonacci sequence. So if you don't know what that is, go look it up, because I think it's something that's very interesting, but it's a way to determine whether something is small or whether it's very large and complicated. Obviously, you don't want to choose to do a whole bunch of really simple things in a release that don't really have any value. On the other hand, you don't want to choose a whole lot of really large items. You may need to take those large items and break them down in order to make sure we can accomplish them. So what we're doing is we're taking the size of those various user stories and we're determining within this time box framework how much can we accomplish. So we have to determine how much as a team we're able to take on. Now, rather than estimating though in duration and effort and work like we normally do, and especially like is done within Microsoft Project when we put those numbers in, we talk in Agile about ideal time. Now, ideal time is being realistic. In other words, how much time do you really have to spend on something? Taking away meetings, taking away the time when you may have phone calls, you may have to handle emails, the time you go get a cup of coffee. So we take our ideal time down and say when we think it's going to take so long to do one of these user stories or tasks, it's based on ideal time and what actually we are going to be able to concentrate on that specific activity. The other thing we a lot of times keep track of as a project manager is being able to figure out how long it takes us from the time we select a story until we're able to deliver it, as well as how long it's been since somebody asked for that until it's delivered. Now, the time from asking for it to delivery, in my case, I don't keep track of as much because I want customers to come in and just throw things out there on that backlog that they might think of at the time they think of them. They'll get prioritized. They'll fit into that roadmap at some point in time, but I don't want to start keeping track of somebody wants to do forecasting and I know it's not going to get accomplished for a year because that's not where our roadmap says we're going to be.
As a traditional project manager, quite often I would basically do the estimating, or if I have a small core team in project management, we would do the estimating. Developers come on board and they get the estimates and then they're not sure about it, and there's some bickering that go on back and forth because we're not sure about the time frames to get things accomplished. In an Agile world, it's a little bit different. Basically, the developers are getting together and they're doing the estimating, they're doing the planning, and they're really participating, so you get their involvement as to what they can accomplish and cannot accomplish. But one of the big differences between a traditional project and an Agile project, we have a lot more fun in Agile projects. People like to play these little games, and I think the little games are great. The planning poker, the estimating techniques really benefit the project as whole. So it's a little bit more relaxed environment than perhaps a traditional project.
Until we get started. And then obviously it's heads down so we can get completed. Once again, as I said, the cost is a little different because in most cases, if we go with the idea that we have a co-located full-time team, then all we do is determine how long that team is going to have to work and what is the blended rate, meaning we will average the rate of all those team members to come up with the actual cost. So once we have our plan, whether it's for the release or whether it's for the iteration, then we start talking about what we're going to do in order to deliver these results by looking at high-value increments where we very often include the review by the customers and make sure that we understand their priorities. We make sure that they provide their feedback, and then we use this feedback to not only prioritize what we're going to do in the future, but also to be able to improve what we're doing now as well as later.
There's different types of leadership styles: the emotional intelligence, adaptive leadership, and servant leadership that have emerged recently. And of course, this applies to traditional project management as well as the Agile project management. So one of the biggest differences is not a command control process here. It's really, we as project managers are facilitating the project development. So the difference between management and leadership, in fact, PMI is really looking more from a standpoint of leadership of a project versus management of a project. Is management looks at tasks, taskmasters, getting things done. Leadership looks at people. We're working with the people to get those things done. Management is looking at controlling, trying to control as much as possible. And leadership, we're empowering the team to get things done because we're all professional people working on this, and people don't like to be micromanaged by any means. They need to be empowered to get things done themselves. Management looks at efficiency versus leadership looking at how effective it was. And as a leader, I have to accept that somebody's going to do something different the way I would do it, but still it's effective and it's complete. So management looks at doing things right. Leadership looks at doing the right thing is probably the most important. So management looks at practices, processes, whereas leadership's looking at really the principles behind those. So command is basically management looking at command, whereas leadership is really communication. And as you know, 80% of managing a project is really communication. We have more leaders in communicating with everybody to make sure everybody's on board, everybody has done a great job. And most of my successful projects, I've always been attributed with being a great communicator.
So the actual concepts that come across for most Agile teams, as I said, is that they recommend full-time assignment. Now, obviously, if that's not the situation that we find ourselves in, we're going to have to make some adjustments and figure out how to make this work. They also talk about having generalists, so that even though this varies by the various Agile methods, Scrum specifically says that everybody should be a generalist. You put an activity, a user story up there, you break it down into tasks, and anybody on the team should be able to go pull that task and do it. That's one area that I'm not sure that I have seen work real successful, unless it's on a project where you really you can utilize those general skills. The other thing is the team needs to be self-organizing. As Steve said, we are not, as a project manager on an Agile project, going to tell people what to do. We don't assign people through that planning process. We put the tasks up and then we let people figure out what needs to be done, so they self-organize themselves to make sure the work gets done. The team size does matter, because one of the things that we have to talk about is collaboration and communication. And the more you have on the team, the more lines of communication we're aware. We all know that formula, n times n minus 1 divided by 2. The more people you have, the more lines of communication. So in most cases, the recommendation is 7 plus or minus 2 members on that team. The other part that was mentioned is the fact the team has to be accountable. When they determine this is what we're going to deliver in this increment, they have to be accountable to making sure that gets done, regardless how long it takes. They also have to be empowered to be able to figure out how to do it, rather than having somebody else tell them how to do that.
In the team roles, project manager manages that project. In XP, they're called a coach, and they basically describe and delineate the roles that are involved in the project. Scrum, it's really called a Scrum Master. They facilitate the daily stand-ups. They remove various obstacles. So I've been an XP coach, and I've been a Scrum Master for several projects working on. And of course, I've also done traditional projects too. And today, I look at a project, and I'm looking at what is the best method for my particular project. And that could be more of a traditional approach, or it could be an adaptive approach, or basically a blended approach. The customer in XP is the on-site customer. If you can get that customer full-time or as much as possible, that would be great. In Scrum, we call it the product owner. There's no official title in the organization called a product owner. Perhaps product manager, you've seen some titles out there, but basically somebody has to basically say they represent that product. Now, sometimes I've had like 3 people that represent that product, because cross-functional, different parts of the organization, and these people have to work together as one. But they have to be, I know we like to have 100% on the project, but that may be unrealistic. we try to get as much time as possible, and maybe I have to schedule some time on a regular basis on the calendars, same time, same place, to make sure that they are available for us. The team decides and delivers how it's going to be done, so they're cross-functional, they're generalists, they're comfortable with ambiguity, because these user stories come in, sometimes we look at them, we're not sure exactly what we meant by that. We may have to go back and rewrite it. And we really want to check the ego at the door. We don't want if you got some senior people versus some junior people, you really don't want the senior people saying how great they are. What about the business analysts? Quite often in some of my Scrum projects, I've had a business analyst working on the project, and they basically are providing a lot of the rules, the business rules that we need. We need to take notes as to what those rules are, so that we have a good understanding of it when we develop the code. In quality assurance, quite often in some of my Scrum projects, I've had a quality assurance person that did the testing. It wasn't just in the team doing the testing, but the quality assurance person was actually doing the testing too.
So the stakeholder, or product owner, as Scrum calls them, basically, as Steve said, represents the business or the organization. So their whole role is to make sure that the value that we're doing is maximized, and they're the ones that continually do the reprioritization of that backlog. So while we are in the process of working through an iteration, the product owner or stakeholder is over reprioritizing based on the current environment of the organization as to what should come in next. They also are the ones that have to provide the acceptance criteria, because they are the ones that are going to be the one that accepts the completed work that is done. Now, the completed demonstrated work, that's another one of the key aspects of Agile, is that we're able to show that something has been done, even if all it is a mock-up or a prototype of what a particular situation is going to look like, so that there's something concrete rather than just a verbal description of what we're trying to do. So once again, that team collaboration, as we said, we put these tasks together, we as a team, and then the individual team members are going to select which items they feel most comfortable working on. They need to make sure they continually go back and verify that understanding with that stakeholder or product owner. And in some cases, if there's a business analyst, they will do that verification with the business analyst. They'll also verify that the acceptance tests have been written, they understand what they are. That whole test-driven method is really looking at maybe even writing the tests before you write the code, and then you write the code to match that test. Continuously doing the analysis, the testing, the designing, the coding, all those different aspects that go into being able to get this finished. And I realize those are IT terms. Those are more from that aspect. We still have those same things within a non-IT type of project. We just tend to be using that terminology because in most cases, Agile started out supporting an IT environment, a product environment, but a lot of these concepts, team collaboration will work on any project. Doesn't have to have anything to do with a product or a code. It could be a continuous improvement that the organization wants us to do. Once we do that improvement, we demonstrate that back to see if that's the results they wanted. That's part of the lean process specifically. The other thing that we have, which I think is something that every project and every project management manager should encourage, and that is to be able to establish some ground rules for this specific team. So it's really the clear expectations of how the team members are going to behave. It could be things like what time we're going to have our various meetings. Are we going to have quiet times when people can concentrate, and other times when you want to encourage that communication and collaboration? That way we decrease any misunderstandings, but we also are able to increase the productivity to be able to handle the different aspects that we need. Sometimes it's a code of conduct. Sometimes it has to do with communication. How do we communicate by email? When do we use video, audio type of communications? How do we work together? And when we're having meetings, are there some etiquettes that need to be followed? These team ground rules have to be developed by the entire team and then enforced by the entire team. And once again, as we go through later on and talk about the continuous improvement on a project, this is an area that obviously gets involved. So one of the other things that we laugh about on Agile is we always talk about the idea of done. What does done mean? Is it that it passed an iteration review? Was it tested? Did the client accept it? Is it ready to be shipped? But the idea is we need to understand as a team, what does done mean? So one of the other areas that obviously is the same with all project management, but the communication changes a little. So rather than having the upward communication of the team members to the project manager and the project manager communicating that on up to upper management, in Agile we talk about an open display of all this information. So we have these current state of the projects and we put them on the wall if we possibly can, or maybe technology to do the same thing, to be able to show how we're doing, how much we've accomplished, our task board, how our testing is going. These things, though, need to be self-explanatory so that if a manager comes in, which is the whole idea, anybody from management can walk in, look at this board, and see the status of the project.
I have a friend who's an Agile project manager, and the company he was working at, they're going to be doing an Agile project for their first time. He put these all these information radiators, all this information up in his work area. CIO came by and said, please take that down. That looks very unprofessional. He was trying to explain it to him, and he had to take it down, and it took a while for him to get it back up again.
But the whole idea here is that everybody on the team, as well as anybody else, is able to understand the status of the project. So some of the tracking metrics that, once again, as a project manager, we worry about is, maybe from the standpoint of the KPIs, with that strategic alignment, understanding what are those key performance indicators that the business is looking for. How many user stories were we able to complete? How many did we not complete that had to be carried over till the next iteration? What is our throughput? How much are we able to do? We use the term velocity because the velocity measures how many of these stories, based on however we're sizing them, usually story points, how many of those we're able to do in an iteration. The quality metrics, though, are the ones that I'm specifically always looking at, and that has to do with how much of the testing are we doing? How much do we are we able to find things before they go out the door? What is the defect rate? And especially those escape defects, which apply to problems that occur after this gets out into the market. And we hear all these horror stories about companies that almost go under because something bad happened and it was not caught internally when it was being developed, but it ended up out on the marketplace and ends up being a black eye for the organization. So the last one we talked about was the hardening sprint, and this is this last sprint before you actually release this all out. So we're making sure that we solve any existing bugs that might be there. We might clean up things so it's more according to the standards of the organization, but we're not adding any new features here. So optimizing performance a lot of times. Also that transition of identifying those release notes and any sort of documentation that's needed. And I know that we hear so often that we're doing Agile, we don't need to document. No, we need to document in the most effective way that provides the information to the recipient of that conversation or that understanding. And the documentation that goes to production support or whoever your customer service people are has got to be done. And this is one area that I see more and more not taking place. The whole idea of regression testing. We use in XP, especially continuous integration is the term we use to make sure that we do that regression testing all the way through. So the last point has to do with continuous improvement, and we're continuously improving the product, the process, and the team. And there's a whole bunch of different methods in order to do this. I have them up here. They call them by different names within the different methods, but they're all the same thing. We're basically looking at what we've done and how we can do a better job. The word that we most often hear now is the idea of a retrospective. And the retrospective is a time for us continually throughout the project to sit down and say, what did we do well? What might we want to change a little bit? And then try, rather than waiting to the end of the project and saying, gee, we should have done this and we should have done that. But we don't know if we had done it, whether it would have worked. And the idea here is to be able to improve the productivity, the capability, the quality, the capacity of what we're trying to do. So there's some shifts here, some major shifts between the predictive and adaptive methods. In predictive, we plan extensively, execute, and test, whereas we are continually evolving those in small pieces on the adaptive. Hierarchical management on predictive versus self-organizing team. Predictive communication going upwards to be disseminated, whereas it's open on the adaptive. In predictive, project managers have an idea of if we have a conflict, how do we escalate that to be resolved? Whereas in an adaptive method, the internal team is responsible for that resolution of any sort of conflict. The strong change control that happens in a predictive also happens in an adaptive, but on a very much smaller range. So we welcome overall change, but once we identify we're going to do something in an iteration, there can be no changes to that. The customer involvement is probably one of the big areas that has really made a difference, in that in the past the customer told us what they wanted in the beginning and then they accepted it or said, well, that's not really what I wanted. Whereas in an adaptive, we are looking for that full-time continuous feedback from that customer. Full solution delivery versus, as I said, small, more frequent releases. Lessons learned at the end of the project, where now we're looking more at the end of each iteration, at the end of each phase. And actually, this is an area that I think you're going to be surprised as to how this has moved into PMI and is addressed within the 6th edition that will be coming out later this year of the PMBOK guide. So we've got 3 simple truths. It's impossible to gather all the requirements, and whatever we do gather are guaranteed to change. There'll always be more to do than time and money will allow. This applies to everything. So we can't be afraid to start even if we don't know everything up front. We can learn as we go. We also don't want to fear or avoid change. Change is good. Change is how we improve. And we need to accept that what we have to do always is going to exceed what we're able to deliver. But Agile is not a silver bullet. As Alistair Cockburn said, a well-functioning team of adequate people will complete a project almost regardless of the process or technology they're asked to use, although that process and technology may either help or hinder them along the way. I thank you very much and hope that this is something that you can think about and apply some of these concepts as a project manager to any project that you're doing.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Greta. That was very informative. So we're going to get to questions in just a moment. Before we do, we just wanted to let you all know that we have a special promotion for recommended courses for this webinar. If you enroll yourself for the courses mentioned below, you'll get 15% savings if you use promo code WPM2303. Those courses are PMI Professional and Business Analysis, PMI Agile Certified practitioner and project management professional. So the offer is valid till April 7th, 2017. We're now going to go ahead and launch a quick poll to find out how many people might be interested in taking some additional training. In addition, we have a lot more informative webinars coming up, so please go to netcomlearning.com/webinars to register. Also, you can also follow our social media pages to get the latest technology updates, and we're going to go ahead and put those links in the GoToWebinar chat window for you to see. Okay, so we got a few questions over here. The first one is, how does the change management process in Agile Scrum differ from the process in Waterfall?
So the idea in the change in Waterfall, well, it depends on whether you go with the specifics thing that PMBOK says, that change control starts as soon as the project starts. I personally think it starts as soon as you baseline something. But once you've baselined a project and the functions and requirements that you're working on, in order to be able to change that, a change request has to be submitted. You have to be able to look at what the value and importance of it, what impact it's going to have on the project, etc. And then you either accept the change and make the changes to how you're doing the process, or you reject it. Now, in an adaptive project, the change can be made up until the time that you select something to go into an iteration. So that reprioritization can happen. If I have a 2-week iteration, it could happen every 2 weeks. Once you've identified and pulled something into the iteration, it's like you've baselined it. And from that point until the end of that iteration, changes can't be accepted.
Okay, now the next question is, would the project charter in Agile still be considered static? Otherwise, wouldn't that be a PM plan if it'll keep changing from its baseline?
No, the project charter, whether it's in Agile or in project management, is purely that initial aspect. Now, in traditional project management, the charter that has two purposes. One is to initiate the project, and one is to authorize the project manager. That's all it's really saying. The project management plan is where all the detail goes. In the adaptive, the only difference is that in addition to that charter, you are making sure that you understand what is the vision and what is the goals and what are that strategic alignment that's going to be there for the project. But yes, it's static. If those strategic ideas change, you got a new project. You're going to have to start an entire new project. So the changes that happen are in the project management plan or in the iteration release plans within an adaptive project.
Okay, great. Now, being that a BA isn't typically on an Agile team, what is a good way that we as project managers can utilize a BA on an Agile team? Please give examples of possible responsibilities.
Okay, well, first of all, we always look at the product owner and say, is this somebody who is very knowledgeable about the business, but maybe not as knowledgeable about some of the details, and they're not a detail person. They are a strategic person. In that case, what you want is the business analyst to be able to fill in that gap, to be able to drill down what are the rules using those business analysis skills. Now, the other thing is, I laughingly say, if we have a user story that's written on a 3x5 card or an index card, and we have the story on the beginning, on the front, and we have the acceptance criteria on the back, the BA is the one that has to fill in what happens when you go from the front of the card to the back of the card. So somebody has to be able to understand all the detail that is going to be needed to be able to do that.
Quite often the developers are very technical in nature and they really don't understand the business, and that's why it's helpful to have a business analyst working with the team, because they can answer a lot of the questions to the developers rather than going back to the actual business person, the product owner, to ask them about basic stuff. So it really depends on the makeup of your team. Agile really encourages that the developers learn that business but that's not always the case when you first put together your teams.
Okay, here's the next question. Where does iteration 0 fall under the Agile planning cycle?
It's prior to, it would be before you start doing your, well, let's go back. I think it probably happens concurrently with developing your product roadmap. So your product roadmap is where you're facing to the business to determine how you're going to chunk this up. At the same time, you get your IT, your technical people to make sure that everything is in place, your testing, your development environment, all of that is ready to go.
You could have an iteration 0 in the middle of your project. You identified some new technologies that you don't have, and therefore you've got to set that environment up in order to continue. So if new technology comes along in the middle of your project, you may have to do a second iteration 0, or do one. So, and if your team is really all the environment is set up, you don't have to do an iteration 0. If you're doing software development in the same environment, you're just for an online application, then
Hello?
Yeah.
Steve and Greta? Okay, I'm sorry, I lost you there for a moment. Sorry. Okay. The next question is in regards to estimating team capacity and velocity, how often are user stories not able to be delivered at the end of their sprint?
Yeah, at the end of the sprint. Well,
yeah.
Obviously, when you start out a project with a team, you're not sure exactly how long it's going to take to get things done. You don't know what the capacity, and there's a lot of learning on that. So we usually don't identify our velocity until we get into a couple of iterations. So we see how much we were able to do. But what we want to start being able to say is that based on what we have done in the past, we're able to select this amount of work and get it done. Now, if we don't meet that, then we have to look at a couple of things. One, did we misestimate either the complexity or the amount of work this was going to do? Maybe we need to break it down into a smaller piece. That's where we move from epics to user stories down into tasks. So we continually break it down so that we deliver a smaller piece of it that we can accomplish. But it's similar to when we do earned value. We always say don't start to measure earned value at the beginning of the project, because you need to be a ways into it to see how things are going.
Okay, and what kind of applications are good for adapting Agile?
Pretty much any type of software development is really good, especially base applications that the company is currently working and migrating over, especially to mobile platforms, are very easy to work on.
The other area that I see Agile done a lot is in the marketing function, where people don't really know exactly what they want. They have a concept, and that way it's almost like feasibility studies, where you try something, is this kind of what I was thinking about? And then I get to the next one and I tweak it a little bit. So there's a Stacy diagram that we use that talks about when you should be using, or when you recommend using, predictive versus adaptive. And the predictive is more when either you have utter chaos and you have no idea what you're doing, or you have a very standard procedure. The things that are in between where you have to be able to adapt. And I would say in an organization that is rapidly changing and trying to react to their competitors, that would be another area where Agile is key.
Where it doesn't work is where you don't have a very good product owner. They have a hard time making decisions. You have a very chaotic environment. Agile really doesn't work there because you don't have team players trying to accomplish vision and goals for the organization.
Okay, here's another one. How do you motivate a team to start using the Agile approach if predictive waterfall is instilled in the culture? What small steps can be taken to slowly integrate Agile approaches?
So I would say that the two things is to try and encourage as much as possible the collaboration and communication between the team members and the stakeholders. Being able to have those open conversations continually, not throwing things over the fence kind of concept that we have in the past. So even if it's just being able to show how much we've done, where we're working. I mean, if I have a project schedule for a traditional project, why don't I put it up where everybody can see it and they can see the progress we're making rather than keeping it inside of one person's software?
Yeah, one of the problems you have with developers that are going from traditional to Agile, they're used to working in a certain environment. You know, they're going to their cubicle or their office and working and doing the stuff, then coming back, and all this interaction and with the team, they're not used to it. They're very uncomfortable. And so you'll find that some of them will say, I don't really like this environment of working in a team and communicating, and I'd rather, you know, the daily stand-ups, they hate the daily stand-ups. In fact, they'll do everything they can to not attend the meetings and have all sorts of excuses. And some of those people, you're just going to have to say, hey, they don't fit the Agile environment. They want to still work in that traditional environment. But as time goes by, as more and more projects are doing it, and they see the environment changing, they usually will start to come around.
The other thing I would have to say is that one of the areas that we run into the most resistance with has to do with the way the PMO has been set up, especially in a predictive environment, especially because they're looking for certain major deliverables in order to be able to move from one phase to the other. And when we start talking about Agile projects and documentation, and you mentioned the business analyst, rather than doing huge documents, business requirements documents, a lot of times we'll draw pictures on the board, we'll sit there and talk about it, and then we'll take a snapshot of it. That's the documentation. It's the recording of a conversation of decisions that are being made, not this huge document that once it's produced, never gets updated.
Okay, well, great. We're out of time, so thank you very much to Steve and Greta for that informative presentation, and to everyone who joined us today. If you do come up with any additional questions, feel free to send them to webinar@netcomlearning.com at any time. And again, we hope you found today's webinar informative, and we look forward to seeing you back here with us soon. Feel free to tell your friends and your colleagues about our webinars and our other courses, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.